What do you expect to happen tonight in Boston?
What's interesting is, as a former player, when a series is tied 1-1, game three, and when a series is tied 2-2, game five are always the most interesting because you pretty much know what each team is going to do. Obviously, there'll be wrinkles, there'll be adjustments, but you pretty much have a game plan of how both teams were playing. And the one thing that will always stand out in this series, and you hear both coaches preaching this, which team can be more physical, the physicality. And it's interesting how, you hear the whole Draymond Green, Cedric Maxwell, the 80s, 90s, today's basketball. The way the game is officiated during the regular season, they want freedom of movement, touch fouls, a lot of replay. And when we get to the playoffs, it reverts back to the 80s and 90s. The officials don't want to be responsible for all these calls. They make it much more physical. So it's funny how during the regular season, they let these guys run around, shoot threes and all that. Come playoff time, there's more holding, there's more hitting. It's much more physical. So whatever team can be more physical, it was Golden State's turn to hit first. And that's what they did in game two to even up this series. To me, going forward, which team can be more physical consistently?
Well, and I'm listening to Draymond. He's a student of the game, but when he talks about, they talk about how physical it was back in the day. And the thing is they were physical with the best players. The greatest player was roughed up more than anybody in Michael Jordan with the Pistons. They allowed that to happen. They would never let that happen now. They would never let you beat up on Luka. They would never let you beat up on the Greek Freak. They would stop it immediately. So when Draymond talks about that, yes, there are a couple of enforcers, but there were a lot of guys on the receiving end of those enforcers. And that's what I think he's got wrong. Draymond would have been great back in the 80s and 90s.
Yes, he would. Because he is let's face it, he talks the talk, but he walks it as well. And he's not afraid to put his body on the line, and he's not afraid to challenge his teammates as well as the opponents. But it's hard to compare eras because there's different rules from the 80s, the 90s, and obviously the 2000s. So I understand where he's coming from. But I will say this. I know he was kind of taking shots at Cedric Maxwell. Cedric Maxwell was a baller back in the day. And I don't think he's giving Cedric enough credit on his type of game because saying that he would have been bullied, no, that's not the case because Cedric Maxwell, he could talk the talk and walk it as well. So I think he needs to do a little history. You're right. He's a historian, but he needs to know that Cedric could bring the heat too.